I returned to Mirror Lake under a sliver of moonlight, my tires crunching across the gravel as if they didn't want to disturb the silence I had once called peace, expecting to find my cabin the way I left it locked, still, untouched by anything except time and wind. But what I found instead was a porch light glowing like a signal fire, a doormat I didn't recognize, and a tension in the air so thick it clung to my skin. My instincts, those that had kept me alive in combat zones halfway across the world, immediately whispered that something was off, and when I stepped out of the truck, I moved slow, quiet, measured, as if the shadows themselves might alert whoever had taken liberty with what was mine, because I knew the locks had been changed. The front door's hardware was different, glinting under that yellow porch light like a barina. Challenge. And the key I had hidden under the post, drilled carefully into a secure little metal box, was gone. I checked the back door next, then the garage keypad, then circled the property like a hunter in the woods. And at every turn, I was met with the same signs. This wasn't just trespass. This was occupation. Someone had moved in. And judging by the still warm Lexus parked in the drive and the faint jazz drifting from the living room window, they were confident I wouldn't be returning soon, or ever call. Crawling through the office window I had rigged years ago as a personal failsafe, I slipped into the house like smoke, and what I saw inside turned my stomach throw pillows that weren't mine, a burning candle that reeked of synthetic roses, rugs I didn't buy, and that damned jazz floating like a mockery over the scene. But the worst part, the part that made my hands curl into fists, was the woman sitting in my chair, sipping wine and laughing on the phone like this place belonged to her, not knowing I was 10 feet away in the shadows, watching, listening, waiting. She was middle-aged, with a kind of face that had been plumped and tightened too many times. Makeup too heavy for a place like this, a silk robe draped over her like she was royalty instead of a thief, and her words were poison. She said I'd sold the house, said she had rented it fair and square, said that manor didn't live here anymore. And as she sipped her wine and chuckled at someone on the other end of the call, I stepped out of the hallway and let my voice cut through her fantasy like a knife. "You're trespassing," I said, and she screamed, the wine glass falling and shattering like her illusion. Because she hadn't expected me, she had been told I wouldn't be coming back, that I was overseas, that I had left for good, and her stammering attempts to explain only made things worse for her, because she didn't understand one simple fact. This was my home, not hers, not the HOA's, not some made-up rental agency she pretended to run mine, and when I demanded to see the paperwork she claimed proved her innocence, she hesitated just long. Enough to make it obvious she was lying. That's when I called the sheriff. But she didn't panic at first. No, she smirked. Like she had friends in high places, like she thought she was untouchable. And sure enough, when the deputies arrived and she greeted them by name, I knew this went deeper than just a squatter situation. This was orchestrated, backed by someone with influence, and as I stood there, trying to convince two sleepy local deputies that I was the actual owner, while this woman paraded around like she was on a reality show, flashing printed papers and contracts with fake company names, I realized I was being set up, pushed out of my own property by something bigger, something organized. And that meant only one thing. I needed to dig deeper, much deeper, because someone, maybe the HOA, maybe this Karen woman, maybe both had gone to great lengths to make it look like I didn't exist. And the only reason I had even come back tonight was because of a feeling, a hunch I couldn't shake, and now I was staring at the reason why scowl. The deputies told me to be civil and work it out in court, and when I showed them my property deed, they squinted at it like it was written in a foreign language, shrugging and telling me to let the county sort it out. But I could tell by the way they avoided my eyes that they'd been told a version of the story already, one where I...
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
But they'd been told a version of the story already, one where I was the intruder, the unstable veteran, the guy who abandoned the property. It was all a narrative, and someone had crafted it well, too well, which meant This wasn't the first time they'd pulled something like this off. That night, I didn't sleep. I camped in my truck down the road, waiting, watching, collecting details, plate numbers, visitor comings and goings, and over the next few days, I learned more. She wasn't just pretending to be a tenant. She had rented the house to others through a shell company, had listed it online under a fake name, and the money trail led to a post office box registered under initials that matched someone on the HOA board, a man I remembered having arguments with years ago, someone who had always wanted to buy me out, who said I wasn't the right kind of neighbour for their new development plans, and it all started to fit together like puzzle pieces dipped in poison boar. I spent the next week gathering proof drone footage, license plate logs, screenshots of the rental listings, receipts from gas stations near the house, anything I could find to show a pattern, a scheme, and when I took it all to my lawyer, a retired judge who owed my father a favour, he looked at me and said, "Son, you've stumbled into something dirty. They've done this before, and they'll do it again unless you make this public." So I did. I took it to the press, leaked the story to a local reporter, and suddenly the story shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't the crazy man in the shadows. I was the victim of real estate fraud and HOA overreach, and the more the public saw, the more they wanted to know who Karen really was, because yes, her name was actually Karen Madison, a board member, a self-appointed enforcer of community standards. And, as her face showed up on the news and questions started getting asked, she panicked, not like the wine glass dropping panic of that first night, but a slow, spiraling descent into chaos. As the lies she built began to crumble, and her carefully manicured world slipped from her grasp, and the cracks started to show not just in her voice but in her actions, because she began avoiding the lake house completely, cancelling bookings, deleting social media pages tied to the bogus rental service, and even changing the mailbox nameplate as if trying to erase her fingerprints from everything she touched. But I had already collected more than Crexen, enough evidence to build a timeline, a motive, and a method, and the more I exposed, the more she retreated, until finally she stopped responding to the HOA board entirely, leaving her fellow schemers to clean up the mess, though they were just as implicated. Because my lawyer had subpoenaed HOA meeting minutes, financial logs, emails, and, wouldn't you know it, tucked between a list of lake access regulations and petty complaints about fence heights, was a motion quietly passed 6 months ago to reallocate vacant holdings for seasonal management, which was their legal-sounding excuse to claim control over abandoned properties, except mine was never abandoned, just unoccupied, and every utility, tax and insurance bill was up to date, meaning they had no legal leg to stand on. Yet, somehow they'd convinced the county clerk's office to flag the property as inactive, thanks to an insider who mistakenly processed a change of occupancy form submitted with a forged signature. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about my cabin. This was about power, land, and profit. Someone had figured out a loophole to quietly take over properties from absentee owners, file fraudulent management claims, and use HOA status as a shield while laundering rental income through a web of fake LLCs, and it had been working perfectly. Until I came back. The truth burned hotter than the anger, because if they'd done this to me, they'd done it to others. And some might never know they'd just come back one day to find their homes gone, sold, rented, or bulldozed. And that's when I found out about Jim Wallace, a widower who once owned a cabin at the far north point of the lake, but vanished from the community records 2 years ago after failing to respond to HOA outreach during an extended hospital stay. His property was now listed under Lakeview Trust Holdings LLC, the same entity Karen had funneled rental income through, and when I tracked down Jim's niece, who had power of attorney during his illness, she nearly cried when I showed her the documents she thought the house had been foreclosed by the state due to some clerical issue. But it had all been a lie, a cover-up enabled by the very people who were supposed to protect community values. From that moment, it wasn't just about reclaiming my house anymore. It was about justice. And I dug in like I was back on recon duty, spending nights cross-referencing property records, matching names, creating timelines, and mapping out how deep the HOA corruption ran. And every time I peeled back another layer, another name appeared: board members, their relatives, even a local title officer who had misfiled 3 deeds in the last 12 months, all conveniently benefiting properties within the HOA's Lakeside district, all marked by some false dereliction status to bypass normal process and sell or rent under the radar. It was systemic, it was planned, and the final confirmation came when I hacked into Karen's burner email account using a recovery trick tied to an old high school alias she used for her fake rental company. The inbox was a goldmine. Invoices, receipts, guest complaints, payout statements from third-party rental platforms, and a chain of messages where she bragged to another board member about how easy it was to acquire another ghost lot, and my lot was Ghost 14, marked as recovered asset pending write-off, language straight out of a bureaucratic theft playbook, meaning they thought they were untouchable, that no one would ever question a paper trail written in passive legalese, especially when masked behind the community image of a tidy HOA board. But I wasn't letting it go. Not when my family's name was on the deed, not when someone sat in my home sipping wine like they owned it. And so I filed charges, formal, public charges against Karen Madison and 4 other board members, along with a civil lawsuit backed by the documentation I'd collected and sworn affidavits from 3 other victims. And when news broke that a retired Army intelligence officer had exposed a property fraud ring within the HOA, everything exploded. Local papers ran the headline. A regional investigative reporter launched a segment called The Lakeside Grift, and suddenly the HOA offices were under review by the State Housing Commission. The Sheriff's Department was holding emergency interviews, and Karen? Karen stopped showing up to anything. Her Lexus disappeared from the driveway one night, and word on the street was she'd fled to stay with family out of state, but she couldn't outrun what came next. A grand jury subpoena, federal mail fraud investigations, and a growing list of victims demanding restitution, all stemming from the single moment I walked into my house and said,
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
From the single moment I walked into my house and said, "You're trespassing." I didn't expect silence to follow the storm. I expected lawsuits, retaliation, whispers through town. Maybe even some sleazy attempt to paint me as the villain in one of those HOA newsletters disguised as a community bulletin. But instead, what followed after the charges were filed and the subpoenas delivered? Something far more calculated. Silence, cold and absolute. The kind that doesn't come from relief, but from fear. The kind of hush that settles over people when they realize their secrets have been excavated and their lies are unraveling publicly. And it began with a trickle. One board member resigned with a vague statement about the burden of responsibility. Another left town for family reasons. And within a week, 5 out of 7 were gone, each exit more suspicious than the last. And I watched it all unfold from the porch of the house they once tried to erase me from, still haunted by their perfume and arrogance, as if the wind itself remembered Karen's presence. And while they scrambled, I sharpened the blade of justice with precision, sending sealed evidence folders to the State Attorney General's office, attending remote court briefings with lawyers in 3 time zones, and assisting journalists who dug up more than I could have imagined. Connections between HOA board members and a ring of fake management companies, forged contracts used to push seniors out of their homes while they were in hospital. Even one case of a cabin confiscated after a fake death notice was submitted to the assessor's office, and suddenly, this wasn't about my lake house anymore. It was about something monstrous dressed in khakis and cardigans, smiling at neighborhood potlucks while they sold off people's histories like garage junk. Karen Madison, the orchestrator, the ringleader, the smiling face behind the HOA letterhead, had disappeared. Her Lexus abandoned in a friend's garage 3 towns away, her email gone dark. And though I expected her to crawl underground for good, it turns out she didn't have the nerve they caught her in Reno. trying to check into a spa under an alias linked to one of her rental shell companies. And when they brought her in, it wasn't with sirens or spectacle, but a quiet, surgical federal warrant for interstate wire fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. And though she tried to lawyer up, thinking she could walk away with fines and a slap on the wrist, she didn't expect the mountain of evidence we had, the timeline spreadsheet I'd built with every transaction, every dollar laundered, every phony listing cross-referenced with her private emails and cloud backups she thought were deleted but were merely archived by the platforms she used. And when they sat her down in that grey-walled interrogation room and laid out the truth, something broke in her. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a cold surrender. A woman who'd spent her life thinking the rules didn't apply to her, realizing that the game had changed and she was now a piece on someone else's board. The plea deal came fast. She named names, gave up passwords, revealed every co-conspirator she could recall, and in return, she hoped for leniency. But the prosecutors, now armed with names from 3 more HOA districts, smelled blood in the water and kept digging, and, while she rotted in a holding cell, I sat with lawyers, victims, and a few surprisingly honest former board members who claimed they'd been manipulated, and I mapped out everything: the acquisition pattern, the HOA policies manipulated to declare homes as abandoned, the way they controlled vote quorums with faked proxies, how they funneled money through real estate brokers and seasonal holding trusts, all orchestrated under the guise of community beautification projects that never seemed to materialize, all while lining the pockets of those who quietly turned homes into weekend rentals without the owner's consent. Meanwhile, my lake house, the place that started it all, slowly became mine again. Not just...
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
That started it all slowly became mine again. Not just legally, but spiritually. And I tore it down to the bones to rebuild it brick by brick, not out of vanity, but to remove every trace of her existence from the structure, every wine stain on the hardwood, every fake chandelier she installed, every security camera she mounted facing the waterline, and with each swing of the hammer, I took a piece of power back, reclaiming not just space but self, because this house had always been more than wood and nails. It was family legacy, bloodline, memory, and no HOA queen could ever replicate or erase that. But the story didn't end with my reconstruction. It spread, evolved, echoed, because by now, national media had picked it up, calling it the quiet theft, and I found myself speaking at housing commission hearings, asked to explain how neighborhood associations had become privatized fiefdoms with unchecked power. And while I hated the attention, I knew it was necessary, because the system had no idea what it had allowed to grow in its own backyard, and the more I revealed, the more officials realized this wasn't isolated. It was a pattern, a business model, hidden inside legal ambiguity. And people all across the country began coming forward. A widow in Maine who lost her family lodge while recovering from surgery, a teacher in Arizona whose desert home was flipped without consent, an elderly couple in Georgia whose HOA sold their home to pay off back dues they never owed, and I couldn't save them all, but I could help expose the rot, and so I did. And then came the civil trials, brutal, slow, bureaucratic nightmares. But Righteous and I sat through them one by one, watching Karen's world dissolve asset by asset. Her retirement fund seized, her brother's company investigated for funneling HOA funds, her fake rental properties repossessed, and every victim awarded restitution paid directly from what she thought was safely buried behind corporate veils. And finally, in a federal courtroom lined with oak and silence, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with no chance of parole, her request for a lighter sentence denied due to the callous exploitation of vulnerable property owners across state lines. And I didn't smile, didn't flinch. I just watched as the guards led her away, and in the final glance she gave me hollow. Defeated, I saw not a villain, but a coward whose empire had crumbled because one man came home early. And now, seasons later, as the lake freezes again under the pale light of winter. I sit beside the fireplace rebuilt with stone from the surrounding hills, listening to the wind brush the pines, knowing that while the house may be mine again, what really returned to me was something harder to name: peace, perhaps, or purpose. Or just the quiet knowing that some battles, the right battles, are worth every scar they leave behind.